Welcome to part 6 of our Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe read aloud. When we left off with part 5, Edmund had gone to the witch. She is none too happy that he was not able to get his siblings there with him. And meanwhile, his siblings, along with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, had taken off and found a hiding place where they could try and avoid being caught by the White Witch. And they were caught up with, not by the witch, but by Father Christmas himself, who gave them some gifts. Peter got the sword and the shield, Susan got the magic horn and the bow and arrows, Lucy received the dagger and the healing potion, and when we left off, they had just finished enjoying themselves for at least a brief moment, and now they have to keep moving as they try and reach Aslan and the stone table. Edmund, meanwhile, had been having a most disappointing time. When the dwarf had gone to get the sleigh ready, he expected that the witch would start being nice to him, as she had been at their last meeting. But she said nothing at all. And when at last Edmund plucked up his courage to say, "Please, your majesty, could I have some Turkish delight? You said—" "Silence, fool!" she answered. Then she appeared to change her mind, and said, as if to herself, "And yet it will not do to have the brat fainting on the way," and once more clapped her hands. Another dwarf appeared. "Bring the human creature food and drink," she said. The dwarf went away and presently returned bringing an iron bowl with some water in it, and an iron plate with a hunk of dry bread. He grinned in a repulsive manner as he set them down on the floor beside Edmund and said, "Turkish delight for the little prince," and laughed. "Take it away," said Edmund sulkily. "I don't want dry bread." But the witch suddenly turned on him with such a terrible expression on her face that he apologized and began to nibble at the bread, though it was so stale he could hardly get it down. "You may be glad enough of that before you taste bread again," said the witch. While he was still chewing away, the first dwarf came back and announced the sleigh was ready. The White Witch rose and went out, ordering Edmund to go with her. The snow was again falling as they came into the courtyard, but she took no notice of that and made Edmund sit beside her on the sleigh. But before they drove off, she called Fenris Ulf, and he came bounding like an enormous dog to the side of the sleigh. "Take with you the swiftest of your wolves. Go at once to the house of the beavers. Kill whatever you find there. If they are already gone, then make all speed to the stone table, but do not be seen. Wait for me there in hiding. I meanwhile must go many miles to the west before I find a place where I can drive across the river. You may overtake these humans before they reach the stone table. You will know what to do if you find them." "I hear and obey, O queen," growled the wolf. And immediately he shot away into the snow and darkness, as quickly as a horse could gallop. In a few minutes he had called another wolf, and was with him down on the dam, sniffing at the beaver's house. But of course they found it empty. It would have been a dreadful thing for the beavers and the children if the night had remained fine, for the wolves would have been able to follow their trail, and more than likely would have overtaken them before they had gotten to the cave. But now that the snow had begun again, the scent was cold, and even the footprints were covered up. Meanwhile the dwarf whipped up the reindeer, and the witch and Edmund drove out under the archway, and on and away into the darkness and the cold. This was a terrible journey for Edmund, who had no coat. Before they had been going a quarter of an hour, all the front of him was covered with snow, and he soon even stopped trying to shake it off, because as quickly as he did that, a new lot gathered, and he was so tired. Soon he was wet through to the skin, and oh, how miserable he was. It didn't look now as if the witch intended to make him a king. All the things he had said to make himself believe that she was good and kind, and that her side was really the right side, sounded to him silly now. He would have given anything to meet the others in that moment, even Peter. The only way to comfort himself now was to try and believe the whole thing was a dream, and that he might wake up at any moment. And as they went on, hour after hour, it did come to seem like a dream. This lasted longer than I could describe, even if I wrote pages and pages about it. But I will skip on to the time when the snow had stopped, the morning had come, and they were racing along in the daylight. And still they went on with no sound but the everlasting swish of the snow and the creaking of the reindeer's harness. And then at last the witch said, "What have we here? Stop!" And they did. Oh, Edmund hoped she was going to say something about breakfast. But she had stopped for quite a different reason. A little way off at the foot of a tree sat a merry party. A squirrel and his wife with their children, and 2 satyrs and a dwarf and an old fox, all on stools around the table. Edmund couldn't quite see what they were eating, but it smelled lovely, and there seemed to be decorations of holly, and he wasn't at all sure that he didn't see something like a plum pudding. At the moment when the sleigh stopped, the fox, who was obviously the oldest creature present, had just risen to its feet, holding a glass in its right paw as if it were going to say something. But when the whole party saw the sleigh stopping and who was in it, all the happiness drained from their faces. The father squirrel stopped eating with his fork halfway to his mouth. One of the satyrs stopped with its fork actually in its mouth. The baby squirrels squealed with terror. "What is the meaning of this?" asked the White Witch. Nobody answered. "Speak, vermin, or do you want my dwarf to find your tongue with his whip? What is the meaning of all this gluttony, this waste, this self-indulgence? Where did you get all these things?" "Please, your majesty," said the fox, "we were given them. And if I might be so bold as to drink to your majesty's very good health—"
"Who gave them to you?" said the witch.
Father Christmas?" stammered the fox.
"What?"
roared the witch, springing from the sleigh and taking a few strides nearer to the terrified animals.
"He has not been here! He cannot have been here! How dare you!"
"But no. Say you have been lying, and you shall even now be forgiven." At that moment, one of the young squirrels lost its head completely.
"He has been here!"
it squeaked, beating its little spoon on the table. Edmund saw the witch bite her lips so hard a drop of blood appeared on her white cheek. Then she raised her wand.
"Oh, don't, please don't!"
shouted Edmund. But even while he was shouting, she had waved her wand, and instantly where the merry party had been, there were only statues of creatures. One with its stone fork fixed forever halfway to its stone mouth, seated round a stone table on which there were stone plates and a stone plum pudding.
"As for you,"
said the witch, and here she struck Edmund with a stunning blow across the face as she remounted the sleigh. "Let that teach you to ask favor for spies and traitors. Drive on!" And Edmund, for the first time in this story, felt sorry for someone besides himself. It seemed so pitiful to think of those little stone figures sitting there all the silent days and all the dark nights, year after year, till the moss grew on them and at last even their faces crumbled away. Now they were steadily racing on again, and soon Edmund noticed that the snow which splashed against them as they rushed through it was much wetter and slushier than it had been all last night. At the same time, he noticed he was feeling much less cold. It was also becoming foggy. In fact, every minute it grew both foggier and warmer, and the sleigh was not running nearly as well as it had been running up till now. At first, he thought this was because the reindeer were tired, but soon he saw that couldn't be the real reason. The sleigh jerked and skidded and kept on jolting as if it had struck against stones. And no matter how the dwarf whipped the poor reindeer, the sleigh went slower and slower. There also seemed to be a curious noise around them, but the noise of their driving and jolting and the dwarf shouting at the reindeer prevented Edmund from hearing what it was. Until suddenly the sleigh stuck so fast that it wouldn't go on at all. When that happened, there was a moment's silence, and in that silence, Edmund could at last listen to the other noise properly. It was a strange, sweet, rustling, chattering noise, and yet not so strange, for he knew he'd heard it before, if only he could remember where. Then all at once he did remember. It was the sound of running water. All around them, though out of sight, there were streams chattering, murmuring, bubbling, splashing, and even in the distance roaring. His heart gave a great leap, though he hardly knew why, when he realized the frost was over. And much nearer there was a drip, drip, drip from the branches of all the trees. And then as he looked, one tree, a great load of snow slid right off of it, and for the first time since he had entered Narnia, he saw the dark green of a fir tree. But he hadn't time to listen or watch any longer, for the witch said, "Don't sit staring, fool! Get out and help!" And of course Edmund had to obey. He stepped out into the snow, but it was really only slush by now, and began helping the dwarf to get the sleigh out of the muddy hole it had stuck into. They got it out in the end, And by being very cruel to the reindeer, the dwarf managed to get it on the move again, and they drove a little further. And now the snow was really melting in earnest, and patches of green grass were beginning to appear in every direction. Unless you've looked at a world of snow as long as Edmund had been looking at it, you'll hardly be able to imagine what a relief those green patches were after the endless, endless white. Then the sleigh stopped again.
"It's no good, your majesty," said the dwarf. "We can't sleigh in this thaw."
"Then we must walk," said the witch.
"We'll never overtake them walking," grumbled the dwarf, "not with the start they've got."
"Are you my counselor or my slave?" said the witch.
"Do as you're told.
Tie the hands of the human creature behind it and keep hold of the end of the rope. Take your whip, cut the harness of the reindeer. They'll find their own way home." The dwarf obeyed, and in a few minutes Edmund found himself being forced to walk as fast as he could, with his hands tied behind him. He kept on slipping in the slush and mud and wet grass, and every time he slipped, the dwarf gave him a curse and sometimes a flick with the whip. The witch walked behind the dwarf and kept on saying, "Faster! Faster!" Every moment the patches of green grew bigger and the patches of snow grew smaller. Every moment more and more of the trees shook off their robes of snow. Soon wherever you looked, instead of white shapes, you saw the dark green of firs, or the black prickly branches of bare oaks or beeches or elms. Then the mist turned from white to gold in the sunlight and presently cleared away altogether. Shafts of delicious sun struck down onto the forest floor, and overhead you could see a blue sky between the treetops. Soon there were more wonderful things happening. Coming suddenly around a corner into a glade of silver birch trees, Edmund saw the ground covered in all directions with little yellow flowers. The noise of water grew louder. Presently they actually crossed a stream.
"Mind your own business,"
said the dwarf when he saw that Edmund had turned his head to look at everything. He gave the rope a vicious jerk.
Of course, this didn't prevent Edmund from seeing any of it.
Only 5 minutes later he noticed a dozen crocuses growing around the foot of an old tree, in colors of gold and purple and white. Then came a sound even better than the sound of the water. Close beside the path they were following, a bird suddenly chirped from the branch of a tree. It was answered by the chuckle of another bird a little further off. And then, as if that had been a signal, there was chattering and chirping in every direction. Then a moment of full bird song, and within 5 minutes the whole wood was ringing with birds' music. And wherever Edmund's eyes turned, he saw birds landing on branches, or sailing overhead, or having their little quarrels.
"Faster! Faster!"
said the witch. There was no trace of the fog now. The sky became bluer and bluer, and now there were white clouds hurrying across it from time to time. In the wide glades there were primroses. A light breeze sprang up, which scattered drops of moisture from the swaying branches, and carried cool, delicious scents against the faces of the travelers. The trees began to come fully alive now. The larches and birches were covered with green, the laburnums with gold. Soon the beech trees had put forth their delicate, transparent leaves, and as the travelers walked under them, the light became green as well. A bee buzzed across their path.
"This is no thaw," said the dwarf, suddenly stopping. "This is spring. What are we to do? Your winter has been destroyed, I tell you. This is Aslan's doing."
"If either of you mention that name again, he shall instantly be killed." While the dwarf and the witch were saying this, miles away, the beaver and the children were walking on hour after hour into what seemed like a delicious dream. Long ago they had left the coats behind them, and by now they had even stopped saying to one another, "Look, there's a kingfisher," or "I say, bluebells," or "Just listen to that thrush." They walked on in silence, just drinking it all in, passing through patches of warm sunlight into cool thickets, and out again into wide mossy glades where tall elms raised the leafy roof far overhead, and into dense masses of flowering currants and among hawthorn bushes where the sweet smell was almost overpowering. Then just as they had been just as surprised as Edmund when they saw the winter vanishing and the whole wood passing in a few hours from January to May. They hadn't even known for certain, as the witch did, that this was exactly what would happen when Aslan came to Narnia. But they all knew it was her spells which had produced the endless winter, and therefore they all knew when this magic spring began that something had gone wrong, and badly wrong with the witch's schemes. And after the thaw had been going on for some time, they all realized the witch would no longer be able to use her sleigh. After that, they didn't hurry so much, and they allowed themselves more rests, and longer ones. They were pretty tired by now, of course, but not what I'd call bitterly tired. Only slow, and feeling very dreamy and quiet inside, as one does when one is coming to the end of a long day out in the open. Susan had a slight blister on one heel. They had left the course of the big river some time ago, for one had to turn a little to the south to reach the place of the stone table. Even if this had not been their way, they couldn't have kept to the river valley once the thaw began, for with all that melting snow, the river was soon in flood and their path would have been under water. Now the sun had gotten low, and the light grew redder, and the shadows got longer, and the flowers began to think about closing. "It won't be long now," said Mr. Beaver, and began leading them uphill across some very deep springy moss. It felt nice under their tired feet, in a place where only tall trees grew very wide apart. The climb coming at the end of the long day made them all pant and blow. And just as Lucy was wondering whether she could really get to the top without another long rest, suddenly they were at the top. And this is what they saw. They were on a green open space from which you could look down on the forest spreading as far as one could see in every direction, except straight ahead. There, far to the east, was something twinkling and moving. "By gum," whispered Peter to Susan, "the sea!" In the very middle of this open hilltop was the stone table itself. It was a great grim slab of gray stone, supported on 4 upright stones. It looked very old and was cut all over with strange lines and figures that might have been the letters of an unknown language. They gave you a curious feeling when you looked at them. The next thing they saw was a pavilion tent pitched on one side of the open place. A wonderful pavilion it was, and especially now with the light of the setting sun, with sides of what looked like yellow silk and cords of crimson and tent pegs of ivory, and high above it on a pole a banner which bore a red rampant lion, which fluttered in the breeze, blowing in their faces from the far-off sea. While they were looking at this, they heard a sound of music on their right, and turning in that direction, they saw what they had come to see. Aslan stood in the center of a crowd of creatures who had grouped themselves around him in the shape of a half-moon. There were tree women and well women, dryads and naiads as they used to be called in our world, who had stringed instruments, and it was they who had made the music. There were 4 great centaurs. The horse part of them was like a huge English farm horse. The man part was like a stern but beautiful giant. There was also a unicorn, a bull with the head of a man, a pelican and an eagle, and a great dog. And next to Aslan stood 2 leopards, one of whom carried his crown and the other his standard. But as for Aslan himself, the beavers and the children didn't know what to do or say when they saw him. People who have not been in Narnia sometimes think a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. If ever the children had thought so, they were cured of it now. For when they tried to look at Aslan's face, they just caught a glimpse of the golden mane and the great royal solemn overwhelming eyes, and they found they couldn't look at him and went all trembly. "Go on," whispered Mr. Beaver. "No," whispered Peter, "you first." No, sons of Adam before animals," whispered Mr. Beaver back again. "Susan, what about you? Ladies first?" "No, you're the eldest," whispered Susan. And of course, the longer they went on doing this, the more awkward they felt. Then at last Peter realized it was up to him. He drew his sword and raised it to a hasty salute and said to the others, "Come on, pull yourselves together." And he advanced to the lion and said, "We have come, Aslan."
"Welcome, Peter, son of Adam," said Aslan. "Welcome, Susan and Lucy, daughters of Eve. Welcome, he-beaver and she-beaver."
His voice was deep and rich, and somehow took the fidgets out of them. They now felt glad and quiet, and it didn't seem awkward to them to simply stand and say nothing.
"But where is the 4th?" asked Aslan.
"He has tried to betray them and join the White Witch, O Aslan," said Mr. Beaver. And then something made Peter speak up and say, "That was partly my fault, Aslan. I was angry with him, and I think that helped him to go wrong." Aslan said nothing, neither to excuse Peter or to blame him, but merely stood looking at him with his great golden eyes, and it seemed to all of them that there was nothing more that needed to be said. "Please, Aslan, can anything be done to save Edmund?" asked Lucy.
"All shall be done, but it may be harder than you think."
And then he was silent again for some time. Up to that moment, Lucy had been thinking how royal and strong and peaceful his face looked. Now it suddenly came into her head that he looked sad as well. But the next minute that expression was quite gone. The lion shook his mane and clapped his paws together. Terrible paws if he didn't know how to velvet them, thought Lucy, and said,
"Meanwhile, let the feast be prepared. Ladies, take these daughters of Eve to the pavilion and tend to them."
When the girls had gone, Aslan laid his paw, and though it was velvet and soft, it was very heavy, on Peter's shoulder and said,
"Come, son of Adam, and I will show you a far-off sight of the castle where you are to be king."
Peter, with his sword still drawn in his hand, went with the lion to the eastern edge of the hilltop. There a beautiful sight met their eyes. The sun was setting behind their backs. That meant the whole country below them lay in the evening light, forest and hills and valleys, and winding away like a silver snake the lower part of the great river. And beyond all this, miles away, was the sea, and beyond the sea the sky, full of clouds which were just turning a rose color with the reflection of the sunset. But just where the land of Narnia met the sea, in fact at the mouth of the great river, there was something on a little hill shining. It was shining because it was a castle, and of course the sunlight was reflected from all the windows which looked towards Peter and the sunset. But to Peter, it looked like a great star resting on the seashore.
"That, O man, is Cair Paravel of the Four Thrones," said Aslan, "in one of which you must sit as king. I show it to you because you are the firstborn, and you will be high king over all the rest."
And once more Peter said nothing. And at that moment a strange noise broke the silence suddenly. It was like a bugle, but richer.
"It is your sister's horn,"
said Aslan to Peter, in a voice so low as to almost be a purr, if it is not disrespectful to think of a lion purring. For a moment Peter did not understand. Then, when he saw all the other creatures start forward, and heard Aslan say with a wave of his paw,
"Back! Let the prince prove himself and win his spurs,"
he did understand, and set off running as fast as he could to the pavilion. And there he saw a dreadful sight. The naiads and dryads were scattering in every direction. Lucy was running towards him as fast as her short legs would carry her, her face as white as paper. Then he saw Susan make a mad dash for a tree and swing herself up, followed by a huge gray beast. At first Peter thought it was a bear. Then he saw it looked like an Alsatian, though it was far too big to be a dog. Then he realized it was a wolf. A wolf standing on its hind legs with its front paws against the tree trunk, snapping and snarling. All the hair on its back stood up on end. Susan had not been able to get higher than the second big branch. One of her legs hung down so that her foot was only inches above the snapping teeth. Peter wondered why she didn't climb higher or at least take a better grip. Then he realized that she was about to faint, and that if she fainted, she would fall off. Peter did not feel brave. Indeed, he felt he was going to be sick. But that made no difference to what he had to do. He rushed straight to the monster and aimed a slash of his sword at its side. That stroke never reached the wolf. Quick as lightning, it turned around, its eyes flaming, its mouth wide open in a howl of anger. If it had not been so angry that it simply had to howl, it would have had gotten Peter by the throat at once. As it was, though all this happened too quickly for Peter to think at all, he had just enough time to duck down and plunge his sword as hard as he could into between the brute's forelegs into its heart. Then came a horrible, confused moment like something in a nightmare. He was tugging and pulling, and the wolf seemed neither alive nor dead, and its bared teeth knocked against his forehead, and everything for a moment was blood and heat and hair. A moment later, he found that the monster lay dead. And he had drawn his sword out of it and was straightening his back, rubbing the sweat off his face and out of his eyes. Peter felt tired all over. Then after a bit, Susan came down the tree. She and Peter felt pretty shaky when they met, and I won't say there wasn't kissing and crying on both sides, but in Narnia no one thinks any the worse of you for that.
Quick! Quick! Shouted the voice of Aslan. Centaurs! Eagles! I see another wolf in the thickets there behind you. He has just darted away. After him, all of you. He will be going to his mistress. Now is your chance to find the witch and rescue the fourth son of Adam. And instantly, with a thunder of hooves and a beating of wings, a dozen or so of the swiftest creatures disappeared into the gathering darkness. Peter, still out of breath, turned and saw Aslan close at hand. You have forgotten to clean your sword, said Aslan. It was true. Peter blushed when he looked at the bright blade and saw it all smeared with the wolf's hair and blood. He stooped down and wiped it quite clean on the grass, and then wiped it quite dry on his coat. Hand it to me and kneel, son of Adam, said Aslan. And when Peter had done so, he touched him with the flat of the blade and said, Rise up, Sir Peter Fenris Bane, and whatever happens, never forget to clean your sword.
And that is the end of part 6 of our read aloud. And just take a moment and think about what Peter just did. Charging into a dangerous situation even though he was afraid. It said he didn't feel very brave, but that's exactly what bravery is. You know, when someone in the armed forces charges into a dangerous situation, or someone in the fire department goes into a burning building to help someone, they know it's dangerous, and they might be afraid, but they do it anyway. That's exactly what Peter did. His sister was in danger, he was afraid, but he did it anyway. And that's exactly what bravery means. We'll continue with part 7 in just another day or two. Hope to see you back, and have a great evening.